We are very lucky to have Linsday Tran here instead as our first speaker. Linsday is originally from Bozeman and graduated from the University of Montana with a bachelor's degree in history. She earned her Master of Science in Historic Preservation from the University of Oregon. She currently works at the Montana Historical Society as the Historic Architecture Specialist. In her talk, Lee Stein and the Tree People, she will discuss how, from the 1940s to the 1960s, the Montana Lee Stein and his twin brother Dee created sprawling roadside assembly of sculptures that were created from cottonwood branches and discarded trash, known as the Steinmen or the Tree People, in the small town of Roundup. Without further ado, Linsday, please take it away.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that introduction. Thank you for having me. So today, instead of talking about photography, I'm going to be talking about sculptures with you. The title of my talk, "The more you do, the more it comes to you," Lee Steen and the Tree People. This quote, "The more you do, the more it comes to you," comes from something that Lee Steen said about his art. There's very little that we have recorded about what he said about his artwork, but this quote, when he was talking to artists from University of Montana who were asking him what his influences were, what his motivations were in making these sculptures, he said it was just something to do. It come to me that I could see a man just by looking up in the tree. I'd cut him down and trim him out so he had 2 legs and 2 arms and put a face on him with a crayon. Some of them I just marked out to make a nose where he'd been sawed off at a slant. I think about it, then I go out and I see if I can find what I see in my mind, looking up into the trees. The more you do, the more it comes to you. This is Lee Steen on his property in Roundup, probably a photo taken in 1970 by John A. Armstrong. So there's a cast of characters in this story. I'm going to be referring to them kind of by shorthand names. So the brothers, Lee and Dee Steen, they were twins. Lee was the more prolific of the artists, so I'm going to be calling Lee by Steen because he was Steen, the artist. His brother Dee Steen, I'm going to be referring to as Dee. He also was an artist, but just less prolific. He didn't do the sculpture. He was a mechanic by trade, so what he would do, he would like split cars apart in half and then Frankenstein them back together, and you'll see in one of these photos an example of one of his works. James Todd was a graduate student in fine arts at the University of Montana. I'll be referring to him as Todd. John A. Armstrong was a classmate of Todd's. I'll be referring to him as Armstrong. Todd and Armstrong never met the Steen brothers together in Roundup. From what I spoke to John Armstrong a couple times over the phone, and from my understanding, the first person to meet the Steen brothers together was Todd in 1963. In 1969, Todd met Steen again. At this point, Lee Steen was living alone. His brother had died sometime between 63 and 69. In 1970, John A. Armstrong finally met Steen for the first time. Todd went on to become a professor of fine arts at University of Montana. Armstrong also taught at the college level, but he was also the executive director of the Yellowstone Art Center in Billings in the early 1970s, and it was Armstrong who curated, facilitated the first exhibit of Steen's work in 1973, and that was in Billings at the Yellowstone Art Center, now known as the Yellowstone Art Museum. I think it's changed names. And I will just, as a quick side note, most of these photos, John Armstrong sent to me. They were digitized by a colleague of his, Robert Weiss. I believe this is the first time in 50 years that a lot of these photos have been seen. Maybe the first time that, for some of these photos, that they've ever been seen. So this is it's real cool. I was really happy that he sent these to me. Again, this is Steen in his property with one of his smaller sculptures. So they're all virtually all the sculptures that we have remaining are made of cottonwood trees and some combination of jars, buttons, scrap metal that are kind of assembled together into these sculptures. You know, some of them were short. As you can see, this one's shorter than Steen. Some of them are really tall, 8, 10, 12 foot tall. And here's a close-up. You can kind of see, I think these are buttons. And then instead, like he said, he didn't really carve. He wasn't a wood carver per se. He would take maybe small pieces of wood and attach them where he had to draw out the facial features. So a bit on the Steen brothers' background. They were born in 1897 in Horse Cave, Kentucky. They moved to Roundup when they were kids with their parents. I think in this photo, but I asked Armstrong, he was like, I don't really know who the Steens are, who the Lee and Dee are. I think they're these kids because they look like the same person. So I think that's them. So Dee served in both World Wars. Lee Steen worked for the Works Progress Administration and the railroad, mostly in Washington and throughout the Pacific Northwest. By the 1940s, both brothers came back to Roundup. They lived together on the same property by the side of Highway 12, goes through Roundup east to west. The property, Armstrong described it to me, was like a very narrow triangular wedge that didn't really lend itself to farming, to ranching, to development, didn't really lend itself to anything except having the small house on there that they had. I'm in the process of trying to figure out where exactly their property was located. So again, like we heard in Steen's words earlier, these sculptures, these are really, so most of these photos I'm showing you are from the first exhibit in Billings in 1973. These are very, I mean, these photos don't really give a sense of the scale, but these were two of the taller sculptures. I mean, probably 8, 10 foot tall. So as we heard in Steen's words, his creative process would be to walk along the river and choose branches that spoke to him, that he saw a person already in them. He would often choose branches with spur branches that were coming off in at least one direction. Those would be the limbs of the person. Like I said, he rarely carved into them. He would add accessories like hats, scarves, bow ties. There's one you can see if you go to Paris Gibson Square here in town, that's where Steen's work is on permanent view. And I believe Dr. Pepper is on permanent view. Here in Great Falls. It was called Dr. Pepper because he had a bow tie made out of a Dr. Pepper can. And that's where he got that was Steen's name for him. He named a lot of his sculptures. So Steen would prop these sculptures up, along the side of their property, along the side of the highway. Over the course of about 30 years, he made hundreds of these sculptures. At the Paris Gibson Square, these sculptures are referred to as the Tree People. In press in the 1970s, they were called the Cottonwood People. Steen himself simply called them the Steen Men, or just my friends. So more close-ups. So you can see there's not really much carving going on. There's like if there's anything being done to the branches to draw out the face, it's adding things in, adding in other materials or small bits of wood. And I think that's Dr. Pepper in the corner. You can see I don't know if you can see that, but Dr. Pepper on the bow tie. No, and again, you can see, what he was talking about, finding branches with spur branches that came off so he could draw out the limbs through either cutting them or they would just already be there. All right, so this is a photo that Armstrong sent me of the first time he visited the property in Well, it's unclear to me whether this is from the first time he visited the property in 1970 or if this is when he came back in 72 after Steen had been relocated to Missoula to a nursing home. So I'm not sure when exactly this photo was taken. At any rate, this was taken in the early 70s, shortly before the exhibit was put together. So like I said, Armstrong met Steen in person for the first time in 1970. Steen was already living alone at this time, and his mental health was on the decline. By 1972, when Steen visited the property, or when Armstrong visited the property again and Steen was gone, the number of sculptures on display had dwindled immensely. It seemed sparse compared to what Armstrong remembered. So I should mention that Armstrong, he met Steen for the first time in 1970, but Armstrong was from Eastern Montana. He grew up in Eastern Montana. He would drive to Roundup for ball tournaments in middle school, and he has vivid memories of seeing these sculptures on the road when he was a kid, basically. You know, in 1970, Steen was in his like late 20s, so you know, in the 40s he would have been a kid. See, I have an excerpt here from the first program at the exhibit in Billings. In the introduction, Todd, remember James Todd, who was Armstrong's classmate and went on to become a professor. Todd wrote the introduction to the program, and he describes the original, what they call the original environment. This term original environment just refers to where the sculptures were built and placed by the artist. So Todd says, my first contact with Lee and D. Steen was the summer of '63. Several friends and I were driving through Roundup on a trip to Chicago. We had not intended to stop until I noticed some large totem-like figures placed near the side of the highway in front of what appeared to be a junkyard. Our curiosity concerning the totems forced us to stop. We eventually began wandering about in what we thought was a junkyard, but as we looked closely at the things around us, we realized that we were surrounded by a systematically structured arrangement of trash and wooden sculpture. The manipulated detail of the place was beyond ordinary description. Plastic dime store Buddhas glued to Kleenex tissues, which were nailed to lawnmower handles, which were wrapped in catalog pages, which were threaded to electric cords, which were next to marbles, which were placed on Texaco oil cans, which were strung with dolls with jar lids for hats next to beer bottles filled with stones. And among this endless array of manipulated objects stood the sculptures. Some were untouched pieces of trees that were so self-evidently suggestive of human shape that it would have been superfluous to have added or detracted anything from their form. Others had been carved and painted, but were badly worn from exposure to sun and rain. So this is what Armstrong saw too when he came and visited the Steen in 1970 for the first time. So Armstrong decided that if he, hold on, let me back up. So he came in 1970. He talked to Steen. He said, "I want to buy some of your sculptures." Steen resisted. He said, "No, because I don't want to sell you anything because the next guy coming down the road might want to see him." But Armstrong, he convinced him. He bought about half a dozen for $15. And he decided, Armstrong decided that if he were to acquire the sculptures bit by bit like this, maybe Steen wouldn't realize that Armstrong was slowly buying up his entire body of work. But when he came back in '72, you know, a year or so later, Steen was gone, and only the tree people remained. And Armstrong kind of told me the story of how this happened. Was that, you know, at that point, his mental condition was such that his daughter, who lived in Missoula, Susan Cook, decided he needed to be moved. He couldn't live alone anymore. And so he didn't really, and this again is Armstrong's account, so he wasn't there when it happened, but Steen was not aware that he was being taken away. So was it forcible? Was it not? I don't know. But, in any case, he wasn't totally aware of what was happening. So Armstrong comes back. The property is already getting vandalized, and Armstrong was afraid, oh my gosh, all this sculpture is going to be destroyed. People are probably just going to burn it for firewood. I have to do something. So he started propping up the sculptures along the road that had fallen over. And the neighbor across the street approached. He asked him, what are you doing? And Armstrong asked him, do you know where Steen went? And the man replied, well, you better talk to so-and-so down the road. It turns out that the Steen brothers, Lee and Dee, had a younger brother, Tom, who was the county sheriff, who lived in town with his wife. And it was actually Tom and his wife who were financially supporting the Steen brothers so that they could continue to live independently on this property. So it was Tom who told Armstrong, yeah, Lee was taken to a nursing home in Missoula where his daughter, Susan Cook, lives. I believe this is a photo of Susan with Steen, unknown date. So with the help of his old classmate, Todd, who by now was teaching at UM, Armstrong approached Susan and said, could we display your father's work in Billings? And Armstrong says that he had to ask Todd to get involved because he was like, I was afraid that Susan would not agree to it. I needed Todd there as kind of the intermediary because Todd had cred in Missoula. He was a professor. People knew him, and no one knew in Missoula who I was. So at this point, Steen was still alive, but very likely not aware of what was happening, very likely not able to communicate clearly or, have any say in this decision. So together with a group of friends, including the then curator here at Paris Gibson Square, Armstrong got a bunch of friends together who had pickups. They drove to Roundup. This was like in March 73, and they gathered as many sculptures as they could. It was winter. A lot of the sculptures were frozen into the ground. Armstrong told me this anecdote of how he they didn't get everything. They got as many as they could. He was prying sculptures out of the frozen ground, including one that you'll see later. It's one of the only carved pieces. It was just like a disembodied head that he pried out of the frozen ground to take with them. So this is an image from the staff at Paris Gibson Square. These actually I learned, so when Armstrong and his friends got all the sculptures, got them to Billings, they ended up repainting or painting for the first time, a lot of them repainting. So these bright, vivid colors that you see on some of the sculptures, these were not what they looked like. And Armstrong was like, he said, I don't know if Steen ever used such as bright or vivid colors in his own sculpture because, they were outside, they were exposed to wind and rain. And he was like, this was a decision that we made at the time, but this is not what they looked like when we got them. So here is the curated exhibit in Billings at the Yellowstone Art Center. It stayed up for twice as long as any other exhibit had to date. People loved it. It was Armstrong and the museum curator who kind of put this environment together. They rebuilt the house in the background. They put down the vegetation. They arranged the sculptures, obviously not exactly how they had been, but tried to kind of approximate the feel of the original environment. It was written up in the Billings paper. They said the paper reported there were about 200 sculptures. This is the curator, by the way. The paper reported there were about 200 sculptures. Armstrong says there were more. There were probably around 300 or so. So both Armstrong and Todd echo the sentiment that Steen may be one of the most original and complex artists in the Northwest. And it was 1973. It was the first time his work had ever been exhibited. And even though no one knew who he was, a lot of people who saw the exhibit really loved it. And again, this is the article where I found the sculptures being referred to, the cottonwood people, not the tree people. I'm not sure exactly where the name the tree people came from. So this is Steen sometime at the end of his life, and this is I was told this was Steen in uniform when he was a young man. Um, so Steen passed away after the exhibit closed in 1973. Armstrong stepped down from the director, or the position of executive director at the Art Center in 1975, and he appealed to the museum to keep the tree people in perpetuity and to assume stewardship of Steen's work. But Armstrong, he reported that the new director told him, but he, meaning Steen, he doesn't have an MFA. He doesn't have a Master of Fine Arts. So basically, we're not going to keep it. So Armstrong was like, fine, I'll figure it out like I always do. And he stored the sculptures in his ex-wife's grandmother's chicken coop in Laurel. He said that he took out about 40, 50 of them twice for an exhibit elsewhere. I think in Montana, Wyoming. And then after each exhibit, he just returned the sculptures to the chicken coop. And eventually, Paris Gibson Square Museum of Art, which had just recently opened up here in Great Falls, they were like, we will assume stewardship. We will take the tree people. So here's another photo of the original environment by Armstrong. You can see this is one of Dee's things. So this is one of those Frankenstein cars I was talking about. Those, unfortunately, I don't think that those were preserved. I think they were just too big to take away, so it's unclear what happened to those. Another sculpture. I really like this one. I think this is one of my favorites. And again, these were all photos that Armstrong took at various periods, probably his first visit, his second visit, and then when he came back to grab the sculptures. Okay, so to close out my talk, I just want to talk a bit about this recurring theme of creative authority and creative credibility that I kind of noticed when I was researching and when I was talking to Armstrong, this question of what makes an artist credible and what gives someone the authority and the power to be an artist. I mean, these were like questions that came up over and over that have come up over and over in the story about Steen. Again, like, you know, even Armstrong, he felt that he is a practicing artist. He lives in Phoenix now. He's a professional artist. It's how he makes his living. He teaches art. And even he felt, he's like, I don't have the credibility to pull this off alone. I have to have Todd, who is a professor at the university, help me get permission to save these sculptures. And again, the director at Yellowstone Art Center, who said, Steen doesn't have an MFA. We're not going to hold on to these. So Steen, he doesn't fit the mold of the professional artist. He wasn't formally trained. He wasn't part of a community. He didn't even seek to make his work known. I mean, you know, he didn't even really want, I'm sure that he sold his sculptures once in a while to people just driving by, but he didn't want to. That was not why he was doing it. And yet, despite all of this, he was still an artist. Steen did not, so we don't have written record of Steen himself expressing any concerns about his own authority to be an artist. He may or may not have worried about it. We don't really know, and that's kind of beside the point. To me, it's not really worth speculating about. But what is worth, you know, talking about and acknowledging and celebrating is that he kept making art. Even though there was no public recognition for what he was doing. He wasn't doing it for anyone else. He was doing it, like he said, he was doing it. It was something to do. So it's funny that even like, because the thing with like outsider art, so outsider art, it's kind of a nebulous, I think it was first used in like the 40s as a term, but like this concept of art brut, which is a French word for raw art. Um, outsider artists, if we kind of look through history, are very often kind of recognized posthumously. But even posthumously, even after his death, there's been very little recognition of Steen. I mean, his work is on permanent display, um, but not a lot of people know about him. And even, I mean, before he died, I mean, you had people questioning, but is he even a real artist? And it's funny because if Steen had doubted his own authority as an artist, he likely would not have created anything. So this is I think this is the sculpture that was pried out of the frozen ground by Armstrong in March when he went to gather as much as he could. Um, Steen's compulsion to create, it's not tied up with a desire for people to know that he is creating. It's not tied up with the desire to have an audience or to have recognition or to have validation. But despite all the challenges intrinsic to exhibiting Steen's work, other artists believe in its value. They did all they could to preserve his art, to save it, so that Steen could get the recognition that he deserved, even if recognition was never something that he wanted to pursue on his own. So thank you to John A. Armstrong, who was instrumental in me continuing with this research. I wrote the first article about Steen like in March of last year, and I didn't intend for I didn't think that it would turn into anything. But after I talked to Armstrong, I was like, oh, this is a cool story that needs to be told. So thank you to John. Thank you to Steve Weiss, who digitized all of these images for John, and that's why we're able to see them today. And to Nicole Evans at Paris Gibson Square, the curator, who helped with content and providing some photos as well. So like I said, the tree people are on permanent view at Paris Gibson Square. These are their hours. What is today? Friday? So they're open till 5. They're open tomorrow till 3. I think they're open right now. I mean, when we went in there, they were this was the only exhibit. When I walked through the museum, this was the only exhibit that was still up. All the other exhibits, I think, are rotating. But you can go there. 1400 First Avenue North. Free admission if you want to check it out yourself. So thank you, everyone.